This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders who are designing the future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and today's guest brings a courtroom mindset to one of the most debated and controversial issues in the world. Roy K. Altman is a U.S. District Judge and the author of Israel on Trial, examining the history, the evidence, and the law. In his work, he applies legal reasoning to cut through emotion, misinformation, and deeply rooted narratives surrounding Israel, anti-Semitism, and modern geopolitical debate. His approach challenges readers to think like jurors, weigh evidence carefully, and ask a simple question: what is actually true? Judge Roy Altman, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And if you would indulge me, please, because I don't get a chance to put a judge in a headlock every once in a while. So I have a couple random things I'd love to
By the way, I'm
hit you up with.
6'4", 230 pounds. I don't think you want to try to put me in a headlock.
Okay, I'm metaphorical headlock, Judge. So my first one is growing up. So I'm a Gen Xer. I think we're probably around the same generation of not knowing judges. Like when I grew up, the only judge we knew was Lance Ito and Judge Wapner from the People's Court. That was our extent of who we knew as a judge. Fast forward to 2026, more people than not can name all the Supreme Court justices. They know district judges. They know county judges. What's it like now to be in a world where judges, people know who you are? You guys aren't like hiding behind a cloak or some giant desk. Tell me about this dynamic now of being such a public-facing figure.
Well, I think some of it has to do with the judge in question. I think there's probably a divide. I'm speaking just for federal judges. State judges are very different because they run for office in a lot of states. In our state, for example, in Florida, state judges have to run for office, so they have to be on the ballot, which means that they have to go around raising money like any other politician and giving speeches and having ads and that kind of thing. So that's a different vibe. Federal judges typically are sort of more behind the scenes, generally speaking, stay in their chambers and issue their orders and things like that. Although I would say there is a divide between judges, federal judges who are on the one side of the spectrum who think, our job is really to issue orders and work with our law clerks behind closed doors. And then the other side of the spectrum, more like my view, is that we really do have an obligation to be out in the community for a variety of reasons. One is I don't think we should be too disconnected from what people are actually thinking in everyday society. We aren't, in my view, a counter-majoritarian or anti-democratic branch of government. It's true that from time to time, a federal judge will have to strike down or declare unconstitutional a law passed by the elected legislators, the people's will, so to speak. But we only do that by reference to a super-majoritarian document, the Constitution, which was passed in super-majoritarian conventions. So we really are super-majoritarian branch, not an anti-majoritarian branch. So I do think it's important for us to be out in the world with people. But second, and also no less significantly, I think it's really important for federal judges to make clear that we are expositors and defenders of the rule of law, of the system, of the crucible of truth-telling and cross-examination and discerning reality and fact-based inquiry that has always been the fabric of our court system since our founding. And I think it's important for federal judges to go out and explain what we do to people, whether it's in high school or law school or colleges or in larger audiences like this, because I think people sometimes, like you said, will read on TikTok or on social media or even in the newspaper that a federal judge struck down what a politician did or a legislator did, and they get really mad about that. But if they heard from us and understood that our role really isn't to say what we think is like fair or just or reasonable, because you don't want us to like import our belief about what's fair or just or reasonable into every case. Our job is just to say what the law is by reference to other laws. Then I think, we might get some credibility with people who would say, the system is more legitimate than I thought it was. These judges aren't really picking winners and losers. They're actually trying to do their job rigorously and in good faith with fidelity to the Constitution and to the democratic system that we've had now for 250 years. So I think that's part of the reason why you see some judges out there more than others.
Awesome. Thank you for indulging me. So I want to get a level set because we want to dig into the book Israel on Trial, and here's an issue with and it's so funny too, Judge. I'm sure as you know, anytime you write a geopolitical book, you worry, oh boy, is this book going to be topical by the time? I feel like when it comes anything to do with Israel, it doesn't matter when you
That's
put
true.
a book out. There's always going to be something to talk about. But I want to get into the separation of church and state when it comes to Israel, because I feel like anytime you hear an argument against the government of Israel, there is the word like anti-Semitism is thrown around. So how do we separate anti-Semitism from being able to criticize the Israeli government and their officials? Because to use an example, Judge, I feel like whenever you hear someone criticize the United States of America, someone will be like, "Well, that's unpatriotic," and I'm like, "Well, I don't think that's the way it was written. Like, if you have to criticize, you can, First Amendment, all that jazz." So tell me about how we can critically, you know, debate the Israel conflict that's going on, like I said, at all times, but like and the religion. Please, let's go there first before we dig into the book.
Yeah. Okay. Great question. First of all, you could call me Roy, and I should just note that I didn't write the book as a judge. I wrote it as a citizen and a person who cares deeply about the truth, about Western civilization and the law. And I don't see it also as a geopolitical book. I see it as a book that's about facts, about history, and about evidence, rather than about politics. But to answer your question most directly, I think that the way you prefaced the question is exactly right. When you hear somebody criticize an African country, for example, you could say this African country is doing bad things. You don't necessarily think of that person as being a racist. I mean, they may be, but that's not necessarily what comes to mind. Just as somebody who criticizes the United States, you might say is someone who loves the country and thinks it's going in the wrong direction. That's not somebody who is necessarily anti-American. But that's where the distinction, I think, starts to break down. And here's why. Because when someone criticizes the policies of whatever the government in the United States happens to be, that person doesn't necessarily, I mean, he could, but he probably doesn't, and doesn't necessarily want to destroy the American experiment and kill all of its people and have all of its citizens expelled to another country and decide that the American experiment was just an evil, horrible historical outlier. Its people should either be killed or exiled, and it should cease to exist immediately. Okay. That's not the situation. That is not the situation we get when people hold Israel to a double standard. So for the most part, I should say I've been on, over 50 campuses over the course of the last 3 years. The conversation that's taking place on campus, for example, that's taking place on the Palestinian street, for example, what's taking place in Tehran or in many of the places of southern Lebanon where Hezbollah operates and other places, isn't, well, we just wish that the Israeli government would do a better job of allowing more non-kosher food on Saturdays. And we think that it would be nice if the Israeli government allowed more train and plane access on the Sabbath, etc. And the government would be better if it just treated Palestinians a little bit differently. No, what the conversation that we're having is a conversation that does two things. On the one hand, it delegitimizes the one Jewish state in the world and treats it differently than every other country on earth. So what do I mean, for example? Well, there's an international body that decides whether famine is taking place in any population on earth. That international body has said that there was a famine that was caused in parts of Gaza during Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, a war, by the way, that Hamas and the Gazans started and that Israel absolutely did not want and had no interest in participating in. That famine declaration occurred, when you look at the data, only by lowering the statistical threshold for famine that applied everywhere else in the world and applying a separate, lower, easier to meet standard when it comes to Israel. That's just discrimination. That's just treating Jews differently, and the one Jewish state in the world, differently than you would treat a famine in Congo or a famine in Sudan or a famine in Syria. So what you're saying is Jews are held to a different and higher standard than everybody else's. That's just anti-Semitism. That's what anti-Semitism has always been. double standards for Jews. I am all for, and I do this all the time in my own personal life, saying that the Israeli government could do this better or that better, just like any government can do things better. But to say that the government was an evil mistake, that Zionism is an evil historical mistake and aberration, and that the people of Israel should be destroyed is not criticizing a government. It's anti Semitism, plain and simple.
All right, so how do we get there? So how do we get to a place where you can criticize a government without bringing anti-Semitism into it? Tell me how we do that without it crossing. Is it an intent? Like, we can't all be mind readers. So how do we know someone is coming to this with a critical eye without bringing anti-Semitism into it?
It's easy. There's no one criticizes the Israeli government more than Jews. Okay, the old joke is you get two Jews stranded on a desert island. They get rescued. They've built three synagogues. Why three synagogues? One for me, one for him, and the synagogue we would never be caught dead in. Okay, so nobody disagrees and quibbles and fights and argues more than the Jews. My family, when we get together for Shabbat dinner, we criticize the Israeli government all the time. The Haredis, the ultra-Orthodox, should be in the army. They shouldn't be in the army. They should receive stipends from the government. They should pay taxes. They shouldn't pay taxes. Whatever it is, the law should be different for kosher on Saturday and all the different permutations. Now in the war with Iran or in the war with Gaza, they should have gone in from the south or from the north or whatever it is. That's all fair, just as it would be for any other government in the world. But when you come in and you treat Israel differently than you would treat any other country in the world, imagine what happened on October 7th. What happened on October 7th is that 6,000 terrorists came into the border with Israel, to its peaceful border communities, these kibbutzim where a few hundred people live with their children, and massacred everyone they could find, perpetrated mass rape against the women and girls in those communities, beheaded children, beheaded septuagenarians and octogenarians, and then took hundreds of people hostage and held them in holes under Gaza, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, deep, dark, dank holes without food and without water and without the oxygen they needed to breathe or sunlight for hundreds of days. And then you have those posters of those little babies who were being held in these holes, and those old people, 70s and 80s, Holocaust survivors, held in holes up in New York and Chicago and San Francisco, and people are going up and ripping the posters of babies down from the walls. That's not criticism of Israel. Those aren't Hamas people, by the way. Those are Americans, and they're not criticizing Israel. No one would have ripped the posters of a 10-month infant who was held in captivity in Nigeria or in Sudan or in Thailand or in Indonesia or any other country in the world, except that when it comes to Jewish babies who are being held hostage and kidnapped from their homes in the one Jewish state in the world, suddenly it becomes the fad of the week for thousands of people in Western democracies to rip their posters down from the walls. Think about this, which Douglas Murray talks about. When a dog is lost in a community, people put up posters of the dog around the community, right? On signposts and on walls, and say, hey, have you seen my dog? If you have, I'll pay you $1,000 and bring him to my house, right? Imagine the outcry in the community if someone were to come and rip down the poster of that dog, rip the posters of the dog down. Everyone in the community would ostracize that person. You're a sociopath. You don't want him to find his dog. Well, thousands, tens of thousands of people rip down the posters in Western democracies, not of dogs, but of Jewish babies and septuagenarians and Holocaust survivors. And where was the outcry? In many communities around the world, not Hamas, not in the Palestinian territories, here in America, in France, in Germany, people were applauded for ripping down the posters of the hostages. That's not criticism of the Israeli government. That's hatred of Jews, plain and simple, and it's totally unacceptable.
Okay. And you mentioned the fact that you talk to a lot of young people, and in the book, you mentioned the fact that you speak on college campuses all the time. If you could teach one concept to every student debating this topic, what would it be? Like, what is I know it sounds kind of like glib to say, but like, what's a mic drop that, when it comes to debating this, that someone can mention and be like, hey, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Maybe you're colored by social media, what have you, but here are some facts. What's one thing one topic, one talking point that could be shared that's truthful and can be impactful in a debate?
When you look at the genocide claim, you have to acknowledge that Israel, and this is something that the high-level military group, the HLMG, which is a consortium of top-level officers and generals among most of the Western armies in the world, from Australia to the Europeans to the Americans, Japanese, Canadians, have gotten together and they've gone to Israel, they've analyzed the war in Gaza, and they've filed a brief of their findings in the International Criminal Court. And what they say is the elaborate warning system that Israel has to prepare and warn and move Palestinian civilians out of harm's way is not only totally inconsistent with any claim of genocide, it's also the most elaborate, sophisticated warning system of any army in the world. But here's the additional thing they say. They say no other army in the world not only has never done it, would never do it, including, they say, their own government's armies. And here's why. I was a football player, okay? A lot of the success of an offense in football is the element of surprise. I'm feinting like I'm going right, I'm going left. We don't tell the defense what play we're running and who we're throwing to before we play it. But that's precisely what Israel does every day in Gaza and in Lebanon. It tells the enemy and its population, we are striking tomorrow in this neighborhood. Civilians, get out of harm's way. When it does that, of course, not just the civilians are learning Israel's plans. Hamas has TikTok and Twitter and social media also. They see those warnings. They know where Israeli soldiers will be tomorrow, and they can lay booby traps all over those buildings, which, by the way, people talk about how every building or almost every building in Rafah was destroyed. They were destroyed because Hamas booby trapped them all over the course of 4 months. Every single building in Rafah was fully booby trapped and was destroyed by Hamas booby traps, not necessarily by Israeli bombs. So what does that do? It means that Israel is purposefully placing its own sons and daughters' lives at stake and risking its own sons and daughters' lives in order to do what? To preserve and protect the lives of the enemy's civilian population. The HLMG group brief says no other army in the world would ever do it because no other civilian population in the world, mothers and fathers, would ever allow their government to do such a thing. And by the way, Israel lost over 600 of its soldiers in Gaza, another 100 or so in Lebanon, when it easily could have done the same thing by carpet bombing the whole area and not sending a single brute on the ground. It sends the soldiers house to house with warning systems precisely because it isn't committing genocide. And here's the last point about that. The numbers bear it out. The average, John Spencer, who's the chair of urban warfare at West Point and has a podcast on this, talks about this a lot. And so does Richard Kemp, who is a colonel in the British Army. The average militant to civilian casualty ratio in urban warfare is 1-9 throughout history. Not because every war that has ever happened was a genocide, but because urban warfare is hard and it's horrible. That's why we should avoid it at all costs. We, the United States and Afghanistan, set the gold standard in our war. The United States and our allies set the gold standard in our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. By the way, we killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in those wars. Nobody is legitimately claiming that we engaged in genocide. Many more civilians died in those wars than ever died in Gaza. No claim of genocide. Again, a double standard. But we, the United States, we had a kill ratio in Iraq and Afghanistan of about 1 to 4.5, 1 to 5, something like that. That's 4.5 civilians for every militant or combatant who's killed. And many urban warfare scholars believed that no other army would ever be able to match that new gold standard ever again, because the average, the acceptable limit was 1-9. Even if you believe Hamas's bogus numbers, the militant to civilian kill ratio in Gaza is much more like 1-1 or 1 to 1.5, slashing by more than 75%, even the gold standard that America and our allies set in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the lowest militant to civilian kill ratio the world has ever seen in the context of an urban war. And they did it in the most complicated urban war in history, where Hamas had used the billions of dollars it got in aid from Western countries like ours and the Europeans, not to build hospitals and schools and roads for its civilian population, but to build a terror tunnel network 500 kilometers long underneath the city, embedded within and underneath the civilian population, making it nearly impossible for Israel to kill Hamas without also killing Palestinian civilians. And even in that disgusting context, the kill ratio is the lowest it has ever been measured to be in the context of an urban war. And yet it is Israel fighting for its own survival in a war of self-defense it didn't start and never wanted, that is hailed before the international courts on false and preposterous claims of genocide. That's why I wrote this book.
All right. Lastly, since I mentioned Gen Xer, since I've been alive, from Reagan to Trump, we've heard U.S. is going to help broker peace in the Middle East. Peace in the Middle East is a phrase that's kind of embedded in our brains since the '80s, right? Is there anything the United States can do, or is this something that Israel and Palestine needs to work out on themselves? Because it seems like we've had many administration, regardless of what political affiliation, they've tried in one way or the other. Is this something that the U.S. either has to stay out of, has to be more involved? Tell me what your take is on terms of like our involvement in settling this in the future.
I've never been more optimistic about the future for peace in the Middle East. And it's precisely because of how strong Israel has been with the people. Because, by the way, the Arabs and the Muslims who live in the Middle East, for the most part, they want peace with Israel. They want to put food on the table for their kids. They want to have good paying jobs. They want a society that can move forward and not backwards. And that's true in the Gulf states, as you're seeing it to be true in places like Lebanon and hopefully one day Syria and Iran. What's happening now in the Middle East, and you see it in real time, are things that were unimaginable for people who were studying Middle East history before this war began. I'll give you a couple of examples. Iran has fired rockets indiscriminately, hundreds and hundreds of rockets at other Muslim countries in the Gulf, the UAE, a close friend of Israel's, Saudi Arabia, Oman, even Qatar, and Bahrain and Kuwait. And those countries, one after another, have come out blaming not Israel, but the other Muslim country, Iran, for starting this war on October 7th, for perpetrating global terror, for trying to build a nuclear weapon with a theocratic, existentialist mindset, and have stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States and Israel because they want progress. They want a new Middle East. Let me give you another example. Just in the last few days, there have been negotiations between the Israelis, the Americans, and the Lebanese and the new Syrian president, who's only there because Israel dismantled Hezbollah in 2024, which created the circumstances for the Syrian rebels to oust the dictators, Bashar al-Assad. Israel's actions in Lebanon freed the Syrian people of a dictator who had been there for a regime that had been there for over 50 years. The new Syrian president was in negotiations with Israel and the United States to potentially invade not Israel, which Syria has done many times, but Lebanon, in order to help Israel and Lebanon destroy Hezbollah once and for all. And by the way, all of these countries, the ones who have formal relations with Israel, like the UAE, Morocco, Sudan, and the other ones that will one day soon have formal relations with Israel, like Syria and Lebanon and Oman, all of these countries agree. It's now been made clear that the head of the snake is Iran, that it's the trouble starter, it's the causer of all of these difficulties, and that it must be destroyed. And once that happens, Iran can be free, Syria and Lebanon can have relations with Israel, and maybe Saudi Arabia will one day too. It's only because Israel showed strength in the midst of a very difficult situation, in a very difficult neighborhood, that it's convinced let's call them silent majorities in its surrounding populations to take back their own countries from the Muslim Brotherhood and the other terroristic entities that had come to control them.
Is Judge Roy K. Altman. The book, Israel on Trial, Examining the History, the Evidence, and the Law. Roy, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. This was great.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Judge Altman and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.